Hi. So I'll just quickly introduce what Senryu refers to. Senryu is a classical Japanese poetic form. It goes back at least 300 years. So it is pretty old now, but it has a very interesting history and it's very fun to read, very enjoyable. Everyone can enjoy Senryu. You don't have to be somebody who loves poetry or somebody who loves literature. Anyone can enjoy Senryu. So what is Senryu? I'm sure many of you have heard of the Japanese poetic form, the haiku. The haiku is generally considered a short three-line poem. In traditional Japanese haiku, there's actually a very clear structure. It's supposed to be exactly 17 sounds long. So when I say sounds, the Japanese word for sound is on. And each on is basically the equivalent of one hiragana or katakana character. So when I say 17 sounds, it will be exactly 17 hiragana, katakana, like that. So that is supposed to be the structure of haiku. It's usually written in 3 lines, although in Japanese, it'll actually be written in 1 line, broken into 3 units. And the units are basically based on the number of sounds or syllables. So the first unit is 5 sounds, the second unit is 7 sounds, and the third unit is 5 sounds again. So 5, 7, 5. This is the structure of haiku, and it's actually incredibly short. Very, very short, terse kind of poetic form. The Senryu is actually an offshoot of haiku. It's kind of like a sibling of haiku. Haiku used to be a little bit serious. Actually, not all of them, but over time, they became a little bit serious. So Senryu was kind of a word game that was created to make it very light, to make it very enjoyable, more fun than haiku, less serious than haiku. First, we'll just read one example and see what we can understand from that example. Over here is one fairly famous Senryu. Again, it's a few hundred years old, so you don't have to worry about that part. I'll just read it out. dorobō o toraete mireba, wagako nari. Dorobō means robber or thief. Toraeru means to catch, capture someone. The miru as in to see, that verb is in a different verb form here. Mireba is like a conditional form, if or when. So when I catch and see the robber, wagako nari. Ko over there is child, you know the kanji now, so it's actually that kanji. Nari is a type or a form of the verb naru, to be, to become, like that. Waga is an older way of saying my own, like watashi no. Wa is another form of watashi, one's own. So wagako nari, it becomes my own son. Or when I catch and see the robber, it's my son. So it's basically a small twist on a social situation over here, right? In the middle of the night, the father hears a sound and he goes and sees, and probably it's his young child who's just sneaking out at night and trying to get some snack to eat, something to, appease his midnight hunger pang or something like that. A very small, simple image, very common. Right? We can imagine this kind of thing happening in anyone's house. You don't have to be enlightened to see an image like this. It's there all around us. So that's the kind of thing Senryu is, right? It's just something silly and humorous that we can observe in our everyday life. In this, you can see the structure, right? dorobō o. There's 5 hiragana, right? Elongations are counted as one sound, on, as such. So dorobō o. It's 5 sounds, right? toraete mireba, 7 sounds. And wagako nari, again 5 sounds. So this is actually the core structure. This is the thing to work on the most when you're working on a Senryu. Not only do you need the words, you need to fit those words into this structure and make it funny. So to talk a little bit about the history, I just want to give you an idea. Where did this come from? What is Senryu? Actually, the name Senryu has nothing to do with the poem. It's named after the person who used to write a lot of Senryu. So there was this very famous poet Tarai Senryu. He used to be the main poet. Senryu was kind of his nickname, his pseudonym for writing poetry. All poets had one of those names after a certain age. And he took up this name because it means river willow. Willow is a type of tree that grows commonly by rivers. And poets had built up this image by that time that they were kind of reclusive. They liked to live away from society. So the willow was a very attractive image for them. They would have a hut by a river, and there would be a beautiful willow growing outside, and that would be their kind of home. That image existed for them for hundreds of years. So Senryu borrowed from that image and made it his name and became a very famous poet of this style. So haiku, before they became these tiny little poems, they used to be written in chains, right? Many, many poems, one after the next. It used to be one long poem made up of many little haiku. That art was called linking, the art of linked verse. And Senryu actually emerged as a type of play of linked verse called mae kuzuke. The mae is the same mae that you know, mae ushiro, right? Before. Ku means poem or verse. Like in haiku, the ku is actually this ku. And zuke is kind of like to attach, to link. So to link a poem to the previous poem. It was a type of word game, kind of poetry game that they used to play. And Senryu was very, very good at these. And that's why his name was taken to give a name to this type of poem. And this poem actually emerged in what's known as the Tokugawa or the Edo period of Japanese history. Some of you may know about it. It's kind of famous. It was also around the time where there were a lot of samurai and things like that. It was at a time when in Japan, the ruler of the country as such was not the imperial leader. That is to say, it was not what we know today, right? Imperial in the sense, an emperor. Today we have an emperor again. Before also they used to have an emperor. But in between for some time, instead of an emperor having control over Japan, they used to have military leaders with control over Japan. And they were called shogun. Shogun. And Tokugawa was the name of a very important shogun. So the entire historical period is named after him because it was in his family, the Tokugawa family. So that was a time when haiku also came out. The poetry form of haiku came out at that time. And what it basically did was, at that time, a lot of samurai started getting educated. They would start reading and writing. Before this, nobody was allowed to read and write. It was limited to very few people. People of religious orders, like monks, they could read and write. And people of really, really high birth, noble families, imperial families and relatives. They're the only ones who were allowed to learn how to read and write. But after some time, these things changed completely and everybody started getting literacy. And what did they do? They started writing about things that mattered to them. They didn't want to write about things that elite people wrote about. They wanted to write about common things, everyday things. It may not be pretty, but that was what was true about their life. So that's how haiku became famous, and Senryu followed right after that, right? With the samurai and the merchant classes starting to write about everyday things. It was also a time when the printing press came in from China, so they could print texts and spread them, right? So before that, they had to literally handwrite every text, even if it was 1,000 pages long. To make one copy, you had to brush stroke handwrite every page to make a copy. It was a very tedious process. But printing press saved a lot of time, and it also allowed a large part of the country to get educated. So all of this happened, and the Senryu followed right after the haiku. The main difference between haiku and Senryu is the subject matter. The structure is more or less the same, right? 17 sounds broken into the 5-7-5 structure. In haiku, if any of you have heard of it, they also have two units that are very important, the kigo and the kireji. Kigo and kireji are supposed to be included in traditional haiku. Kisetsu, go is language or word. We know that, right? Kisetsu means season. So kisetsu go. In other words, a season word. A word that indicates what the current season is. That was very important to haiku. That's why a lot of them were actually about nature. They were about things happening in nature. Kireiji is, again, not very important. It's just a structural part of haiku. But the good news is, Senryu does not need any of these things. No kigo, no kireiji. There's no rigid rules about what you write about. There's no sense of comparison or juxtaposition, which was there in haiku. All of those things are done away with. So the Senryu becomes a much simpler type of poem. Everyone can write Senryu. It doesn't have to rhyme. Generally speaking, Japanese poems do not rhyme because it's too easy to rhyme in Japanese. There are so few sounds. Everything ends in a, i, u, e, o. So you can imagine rhyming would be very, very easy. So they felt it's not important. So nothing will rhyme. You don't have to worry about that. And the important thing is, it's funny. It's humorous. It's satirical, right? You're playing on things that are funny about everyday human situations and life. So it's all about human nature, all about the drama, the comedy, the foibles of everyday interactions. That's what Senryu really is. I want to just quickly run through this. We don't have to go into detail, but the Senryu, the haiku, actually have a very long history. They go back really far, even though they didn't exist in that form. In the 8th century in Japan, there existed a poetic form called tanka. It's also known as waka. It was very, very famous. It's still famous. There are still people in Japan writing tanka or waka. So you can see it's like so many centuries old, but it's still alive today. That poem had this kind of structure. And if you notice, the first part, 575, is what is retained today in haiku and senryu. So it's a really old history. And as I was saying earlier, poems were often not written in isolation. Poets like to converse poetry. They would exchange poems. Right? They would give them to each other in reply to other poems. So in very early poetry texts in Japan, like the Manyoshu, it's really old. It's 4,000 plus poems in one book, and it's very hard to read. But over there, you can find these tanka, with people having dialogue using tanka, exchanging tanka to kind of communicate with each other. And over time, as a history unfolded in Japan, tanka composition became very important. And that tanka is what became what's known as renga, or linked verse composition. It broke into two parts, and one poet would write one part, another would write the next, and there would be entire gatherings of poets linking their poems to each other. This is just a beautiful idea. You can see about 4 or 5 poets sitting in a room, each one composing one poem after the next, linking with each other and drawing a bigger type of poem out of it. And from there, we got what is known as haiku. The haiku itself brought in a lot of humor into poetry compared to before. The most famous haiku poet is Matsuo Basho, and he made it very spiritual, kind of serious. So other people like to keep it light. They participated in games like Maekuzuke, Kyoku, Zareku. And that's the kind of humorous, having fun kind of spirit that Senryu really came from. So before I show some examples, I thought since I'd like all of you to try to write Senryu, I'll just share some ideas. Where does humor come from? What are the mechanics of humor? Usually, the key to humor is incongruity or disharmony. That is, you have an expectation, but reality is something different, right? And that mismatch, what happens, what you expect versus what happens, that instigates humor. So if you go back to that dorobō poem, right? The one we saw in the very beginning. You have a house here and a man is sleeping, it's the middle of the night, there's a robber who breaks in, and you expect something serious to happen, but it turns out to be his own child. That is a twist on the expectation of the reader, of the listener, and it instigates humor. So it's typically things like this, right? If you think back on anything that made you laugh, why did you laugh? Because it built up to something and then they completely turned it on its head. So that's something we can use to make really good humor. Wordplay, puns, right? Using words, using double meaning, things like that. That's a very common way of instigating humor. Irony, again, irony is basically expectation versus reality. It's the same thing. Ambiguity, not being clear about what you're trying to say, that also creates humor. And basically looking for the funny aspects of reality, right? Things that are quirky in the things that humans do, our weaknesses, our small little weaknesses that give us away. Those are the things you want to look for. So just go home, observe your family, observe your friends, and think of what you can write that'll be humorous. Sometimes we have comic heroes who are very clumsy. We write about their misfortune, right? They're supposed to be heroes, but then they end up in misfortunate situations, or they triumph in an unexpected way. Those kinds of things are also the stuff of Senryu. So those breaking out of the social expectation or constraint is what we expect in Senryu. With this, I'd like to give you some examples. I think examples are ultimately what will make it easier to understand how to write Senryu. So here's this first one. This is all of the poems I'm going to share with you are very old classical Senryu. So you don't have to use the same type of language. I will give you a couple of my own examples at the end that might make it seem easier. But this is just to show you the types of things we can talk about in Senryu. For example, over here, 木があれば目も口ほどに物を言う. The key over here is the same key that we learned in Genki, Tenki, right? Key is like will, energy, power, spirit, all of those things. 木があれば. Areba is a version of aru, arimasu. If you have the will, me, kuchi. Me is eyes, kuchi is mouth. Me also, right? Me mo, kuchi hodo. Hodo means the level of, the extent of. So the eyes too, to the extent of the mouth, can say things. Mono o iimasu, to say, to speak. Mono is thing. So where there's a will, the eyes can speak as much as the mouth, right? And I guess you can relate to it if you've heard the expression, looks can kill. My mother has that look. She can just give us all one glare without a single word. She can make us all, close our mouths. So this kind of poem, right? That humor in human interaction. I'll give you a few more examples. I think this is also very relatable. 一言も言わず女房のうちになる. Gon is word, like vocabulary. It's an older way of saying it, but it's you can still see it in some compound words. Ichi is one, so ichigon, one word. Without a word. Iwazu is without saying. You learn these verb forms as you proceed in higher levels. Right? It's without saying. It's a form of the word imasu, to say, to speak. Nyobo is an older word for wife. It's not used much anymore. Uchi is home. Nari is another form of narimasu, to become. So without saying a word, the wife makes it her own home. Right? She takes control of the house. You can also see that 5-7-5 structure, right, in these poems. Ichi, go, right? Hi. We'll see a couple more examples. I think you can also get an idea from a good variety. こう持って近所の犬の名を覚え。こを持つ to have a child, right? To basically you have a child in your care. Kinjo is the word for neighborhood. Inu, dog. Na, short for namae, name. Oboe means to remember or to learn. Oboeru. We'll be learning it soon. So now that he has a child, he knows all the local dogs by name. Right. So of course, you can get such a clear picture, right? This child going around, interacting with all of the dogs, giving them names, playing with them, and then coming back and telling all those stories to his family with a lot of energy, a lot of gusto. Right. A couple more, we'll just quickly look at these. Shikarareru. Tabi ni musuko no toshi ga shire. Shikarareru means to get scolded, to be shouted at. Tabi is time. Tabi ni musuko is son. Toshi, age. Shire is a version of shiru, shirimasu, to know. So every time the son gets scolded, people learn how old he is. Because this is also very common, right? Every time our parents yell at us, they're like, at this age, you're still behaving like this. You're almost 15 now. You're almost 20 now. You're almost 25. You're 30. This will go on until we're 50, right? So every time there's an update about our age when we get scolded. So again, you can see this kind of humorous approach to a very common everyday image. I wanted to share a few examples which are food related because this Senryu contest that's coming up is entirely about food. So here's all three of these poems are going to be about one food item. It's a very important food item in Japan. Hai. Me ni ao ba. Yama hoto to gisu. Hatsu gatsuo. Me ni aoba. Aoba is green leaves. Me is eyes. So for the eyes, the green leaves. This is the treat. The treat for the eyes is the sight of fresh budding green leaves. Yama hototogisu. Hototogisu is a cuckoo. Yama is actually mountain, but it also refers to like mountain forests, like that. So for the ears, the delight is listening to the cuckoo. For the eyes, the delight is seeing the green leaves, the fresh green leaves. Hatsu, gatsuo. Gatsuo is another alternate pronunciation of katsuo, which is the word for bonito. It's a type of fish. Summer means bonito in Japan. They love this fish. It's a migrational patterns indicate that it usually comes by around April, May. And when you catch bonito at that time, it's supposed to taste the best. So it's one of the most celebrated and enjoyed food items of the summer season in Japan. That's just one poem. So apparently, if the eyes have a delight and the ears have a delight, for the tongue, it's bonito. Here's another example. I really like this one. Right. Me mo hana mo tada da ga kuchi wa takaku. Me, hana, eyes and nose. Tada means free. Daga is desuga, right? But, right? Like the but. It's the same thing. So for the eyes and for the nose, pleasures are free. You don't have to pay to see something beautiful. If it's there, you can see it. You don't have to pay to smell something beautiful. If you cross by a restaurant, you'll smell it, right? Kuchi wa takaku tsu. Kuchi is mouth. For the mouth alone, we have to pay a lot. For any delight, we have to pay a lot of money. Right? It costs nothing for the eye and the ear, but a lot for the mouth. And one last one, hatsugatsuo. Again, it's back, the bonito, right? Ningen wa wazuka. Na zo o kao. So this is actually an expression. Humans are temporary. Humans are short. Our lives are short. Wazuka means short or temporary. Nazo is like thinking that. Thinking this, I buy it. Kau kaimasu, to buy. So thinking life is short, I buy a, right? You gotta enjoy, it's like YOLO, right? Live when you can. Enjoy the beauties of the seasons while you can. Right. So I hope this has given you an idea of some Senryu and what you could write, things you can think of for the Oishi Senryu contest. As I said, you can find it in the Hayakawa events page or in the home page. You can scroll down and follow the link. ぜひsenryuを作ってください。Please make some senryu. As a last note, I will share a couple of senryu that I wrote myself. They're nothing special, but I wanted you to feel that it's very simple and doable. The first one is チームランチ。チームランチ。Sorry. 今日の仕事は居眠りぞ。Team lunch. Today's work is to sleep. So you go out for a team lunch with the office, and of course, you ate too heavily and cannot work for the rest of the day. Another one is 手に入れば誰もが子供。春高は。I tried my best to put this in Japanese. I hope some of you know what palkoa is. It's one of my favorite sweets. If you can get your hands on it. Hey here is hand. If it's there in your hand, this is a conditional form. If it's there in your hand, 誰も anyone. が subject particle, 子供 child. Okay? If it's in your hand, anyone is a child. It's a sweet. Okay? Palkoa. You can replace it with any sweet, whatever makes you very happy. Toraete, right? Or any other sweet you can think of. But even a very mature adult will feel like a child again, right? When we get our hands on our favorite sweet. So these are just a couple of examples. Both of them had to do with food. So I thought I'd give you an idea of what you could write.